Chapter 3, Sections 3 and 4 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 3, The Joint Government of the Princeps and the Senate, Sections 3 and 4. Section 3. The Princeps and the Magistrates. We have seen that the republican magistrates continued to be elected under the Empire, and they were still supposed to exercise their functions independently. Under the dictatorship of Julius Caesar, they had been subject to the maius imperium of the dictator. But it was not so under the Principate. The Princeps has no maius imperium over them, as he has over the proconsul abroad. His power is only coordinate, but on the other hand it is quite independent. The dignity of the consulate was maintained, and it was still a coveted post. Indeed, new though reflected lustre seemed to be shed on the supreme magistracy by the fact that it was the only magistracy which the Princeps deigned occasionally to hold himself. To be the emperor's colleague was a great distinction indeed. The consuls still gave their name to the year of their office, and they retained the right of conducting and controlling the elections in the popular assemblies. It has already been mentioned that a new senatorial court was instituted, in which they were the presiding judges. Augustus also assigned the consuls some new duties in civil jurisdiction. But he introduced the fashion of replacing the consuls who entered upon office in January by a new pair of consuli suffecti at the end of 6 months. This custom, however, was not definitely legalized, and was sometimes not observed. In later times 4 monthly consulates were introduced, and later still 2 monthly. The number of praetors had been increased to 16 by Julius Caesar. Augustus at first reduced the number to 8, he then added 2 praetores aerarii. Afterwards he increased them again to 16, but finally fixed the number at 12. The chief duties of the praetors were, as before, judicial. But Augustus assigned to them the obligation of celebrating public games, which formerly had devolved upon the consuls and the aediles. A college of 10 tribunes were still elected every year, but the office became unimportant, and the chief duties of a tribune were municipal. The aediles also lost many of their functions. Augustus divided the city of Rome into 14 regions, over each of which an overseer or prefect presided. These overseers were chosen from the praetors, aediles, and tribunes. The quaestorship was a more serious and laborious office. Sulla had fixed the number of quaestors at 20, Julius Caesar raised it to 40, Augustus reduced it again to 20. Quaestors were assigned to the governors of senatorial provinces. The proconsul of Sicily had 2. 2 quaestors were at the disposal of the emperor, to bear communications between him and the senate. The consuls had 4 quaestors, and these were 2 quaestores urbani. This magistracy had an importance over and above its proper functions, in that it qualified for admission into the senate. Thus, as long as the quaestors were elected by the comitia, the people had a direct voice in the formation of the senate, and thus, too, the emperor, by his right of commendation already mentioned, exercised a great though indirect influence on the constitution of that body. The vigintivirate was held before the quaestorship. It comprised 4 distinct boards. The tresviri capitales, on whom it devolved to execute capital sentences; the tresviri monetales, who presided at the mint; the quatuorviri viis in urbe purgandis, officers who looked after the streets of Rome; and the decemviri slitibus iudicandis, who were now appointed to preside in the centumviral courts. The republican magistrates formed a civil service and executive for the senate. The Princeps had no such assistance at his disposal. As a magistrate he was supposed, like a consul or praetor, to do everything himself. The personal activity, which is presupposed on the part of the Princeps, is one of the features which distinguish the Principate from monarchy. It followed, as a consequence of this theory, that all the officials who carried out the details of administration for which the emperor was responsible, were not public officers, but the private servants of the emperor. A freedman fulfilled duties which in a monarchy would devolve upon a secretary of state. The Emperor had theoretically a perfect right to have appointed, if he chose, freedmen, or citizens of any rank, as governors in the provinces which he was supposed to govern himself. It was due to the sound policy of Augustus and his self-control that he made it a strict rule, which his successors maintained, only to appoint senators, and in certain cases knights, to those posts. He also voluntarily defined the qualification of equestrian rank for the financial officers, procuratores Augusti, who represented him in the provinces. But the position of the knights must be more fully explained. Section 4. The Equites. The equestrian order was reorganized by Augustus, and altered both in its constitution and in its political position. 1. Constitution. In the early republic the equites were the citizen cavalry, who were provided with horses for their military service at public cost, but in the later republic there had come to be three classes of equites: those who were provided with public horses, equus Romanus equo publico, those who provided their own horses, and those who by estate or otherwise were qualified for cavalry service but did not serve. The two last classes were not in the strictest speech Roman knights, and they were abolished altogether by Augustus, who thus returned to the system of the early republic. Henceforward every knight is an equus Romanu equo publico, and the whole ordo equester consists of such. 2. Admission. The Emperor himself assumed the right of granting the public horse which secured entry into the equestrian order. The chief qualifications were the equestrian census, free birth, soundness of body, good character, but the qualification of free birth was not strictly insisted on under the Empire, and freedmen were often raised to be knights. A senator's son necessarily became a knight by virtue of his birth, and thus for men born in senatorial rank, knighthood was a regular stage before entry into the Senate. There was a special official department, ad census equitum Romanorum, for investigating the qualifications of those who were admitted into either of the two orders, ordo uterque, as the Senate and the knights were called. 3. Life tenure. Another innovation of Augustus consisted in making the rank of knight tenable for life. Apart from degradation, as a punishment or a consequence of the reduction of his income below the equestrian rating, 400,000 sesterces, a knight does not cease to be a knight, unless he becomes a senator or enters legionary service. Legionary service was so attractive under the Empire, that cases often occurred of knights surrendering their rank in order to become centurions. 4. Equitum probatio. It was an old custom that the equites Romanae equo publico should ride annually, on the Ides of July, in full military caparison from the temple of Mars at the Porta Capena, first to the Forum to offer sacrifice there to their patron gods, Castor and Pollux, and then on to the Capitol. This procession, called the Transvectio Equitum, had fallen into disuse, and Augustus revived it and combined it with an Equitum probatio, or review of the knights. Sitting on horseback and ordered according to their turme, the knights passed before the Emperor, and the name of each was called aloud. The names of any whose behaviour had given cause for censure were passed over, and they were thus expelled from the order. Here the Emperor discharged duties, which before the time of Sulla had been discharged by the censors. He was assisted by 3 or 10 senators appointed for the purpose. 5. Organization. The equestrian order was divided into turmae, 6 in number, each of which was commanded by one of the Severi Equitum Romanorum. The Severi were nominated by the Emperor, and changed annually like the magistrates. They were obliged to exhibit games, ludi severales, every year. It is to be observed that the knights were not organized or treated as a political body like the Senate. They had no machinery for action, no common political initiative, no common purse. 6. Privileges. In dress the Roman eques were distinguished by the military mantle called trebia, and the narrow purple stripe, angustus clavis, on the tunic. They also wore a gold ring, and this was considered so distinctively a badge of knighthood, that the bestowal of a gold ring by the Emperor became the form of bestowing knighthood. The children of a knight, like those of a senator, were entitled to wear the gold bulla. In the theatre special seats, the 14 rows, were reserved for the knights, and Augustus (5 A.D.) assigned them special seats also at races in the circus and at gladiatorial spectacles. 7. Service of the knights as officers. The chief aim of Augustus in reorganizing the knights was military. He desired to procure competent officers in the army, from which posts he excluded senators entirely. Men of senatorial rank, however, who, as has been already mentioned, became knights before they were old enough to enter the senate, regularly served a militia, as it was called. The officer posts here referred to are the subordinate commands, not the supreme commands of legions, and are of three kinds. A. Praefectura cohortis, or command of an auxiliary cohort. B. Tribunatus militum, in a legion. C. Praefectura alle, command of an auxiliary cavalry squadron. The Emperor, as the supreme military commander, made the appointments to these militiae equestres. Service as officers seems to have been made obligatory on the knights by Augustus. As knights only could hold these posts, there was no system of regular promotion for soldiers into the officer class. But it often happened that soldiers who had distinguished themselves, and had risen to the first rank of centurions, who corresponded somewhat to our non-commissioned officers, received the equus publicus from the Emperor, and thus were able to become tribunes and prefects. As a rule the officers held their posts for several years, and it was considered a privilege to hold the tribunatus semestris, which could be laid down after 6 months. 8. Service of knights as jurymen. In 122 B.C., C. Gracchus had assigned the right of serving as iudices exclusively to the knights. 40 years later, 81 B.C., Sulla restored it to the senate. Then, in 70 B.C., a compromise between the two orders was made by the law of L. Aurelius Cotta, whereby the list of jurymen was composed of 3 classes, called decuriae, the first consisting entirely of senators, the second of knights equo publico, the third of tribuni aerarii. As the last class possessed the equestrian census and belonged to the equestrian order in the wide sense in which the term was then used, although they had not the equus publicus, this law of Cotta really gave the preponderance to the knights. The total number of iudices was 900, each class contributing 300. This arrangement lasted till 46 B.C., when Caesar removed the tribuni aerarii from the third class and filled it with knights in the strict sense. Augustus excluded the senators altogether from service as iudices, and while he preserved the 3 decuriae, filled them with knights. But he added a 4th decuria for service in unimportant civil trials, consisting of men who possessed more than half the equestrian income, ducenarii. Only men of at least 30 years of age were placed on the list of iudices, and, in the time of Augustus, only citizens of Rome or Italy. 9. Employment of knights in state offices. By reserving the posts of officers and iudices for the knights to the exclusion of the senators, Augustus was carrying out the design of C. Gracchus, and giving the knights an important political position, so that they were in some measure coordinated with the senate as a factor in the state. But he went much further than this. He divided the offices of administration and the public posts between the senators and the knights. The general principle of division was that those spheres of administration which are more closely connected with the Emperor personally were given to knights. The legateships of legions, however, were reserved for senators, as also the governorships of those provinces which had been annexed under the Republic. But new annexations, such as Egypt, Noricum, and Raetia, were entrusted to knights, and likewise the commands of new institutions, such as the fleet and the auxiliary troops. Financial offices, the collection of taxes, and those posts in Rome and Italy, to be mentioned in Chapter 5, which the Emperor took charge of, were also reserved for knights. The selection of the procuratores Augusti, or tax officers, in the provinces from the knights alone was some compensation to them for the loss of the remunerative field which they had occupied under the Republic as publicani. As the taxes in the imperial provinces were no longer farmed, but directly levied from the provincials, the occupation of the knights as middlemen, by which they had been able to accumulate capital and so acquire political influence, was gone. Under the Principate they were an official class. Those knights who held high imperial offices were called equites illustres. 10. Elevation of knights to the senate. Knights of senatorial rank, that is, sons of senators, who had not yet entered the senate, formed a special class within the equestrian order, to which they, as a rule, only temporarily belonged, and wore the badges of their senatorial birth. They could ordinarily become senators on reaching the age of 25. For knights who were not of senatorial rank there was no regular system of advancement to the senate. But the Emperor, by assuming censorial functions, could exercise the right of adlectio, and admit knights into the senate. It seems to have been a regular usage to admit into the senate the commander of the praetorian guards when he vacated that post. End of Chapter 3, Sections 3 and 4. Recording by Trisha G.